They thought the past was buried, but for Caleb Frost, it was carved deep into every memory of Rutherford Academy. He had been the boy in the corner, the one whispered about, mocked for his quiet voice, his worn-out hoodie, and above all, for the rainbow pin he once clutched at graduation. To his classmates, he wasn't simply shy, he was that weird gay kid, the easy target, the loser they could humiliate to make themselves feel stronger. And while the years had passed, scars like those never fully faded. So when the envelope arrived, resting neatly on his apartment floor, he knew instantly what it was: an alumni reunion. The words on the card were polished, formal, almost kind, but beneath the calligraphy, Caleb could hear the sneers. He could see the smirks that had chased him out of the cafeteria. This wasn't about reconnecting, it was bait. They wanted to see if he had failed, if he had remained the same fragile boy who once left school grounds with lowered eyes and burning shame. Caleb picked up the invitation slowly, his fingertips tracing the embossed crest of Rutherford. He folded the card into a sharp square and slipped it into his pocket. The truth was, their trap didn't frighten him anymore. They didn't know who he had become, how far he had traveled from that broken boy on the graduation stage. To them, he was still the punchline. To him, they were only echoes of a past that no longer controlled him. When the evening of the reunion approached, he didn't buy a new suit or polish himself to meet their expectations. He chose the same armor he had always worn: a simple hoodie, faded jeans, sneakers softened by years of walking. It wasn't a costume of failure. It was a reminder of where he had started. Only he knew the difference this time. Only he carried the truth of who Caleb Frost was now. He looked in the mirror before leaving, the rainbow pin tucked safely in a drawer at home. Not out of fear, but because he no longer needed to prove anything with symbols. His existence, his survival, and what he had built with his own hands, that was enough. The boy they had once thrown words at like knives was stepping into that hall not as prey, but as someone who understood the cruel theater they had scripted. And he was ready to let them play their parts, because he knew how the story would end. There's a quiet power in walking back into the fire that once burned you, not to be consumed again, but to show that you are the flame's master. Caleb wasn't returning to seek validation. He wasn't coming back to fit in. He was returning because sometimes the best revenge isn't shouted, it's revealed. And as he closed his apartment door and stepped into the night, his breath steady, his mind clear, he carried with him one unshakable truth: being different had never been his weakness. It had been his gift all along. For those who have ever been laughed at, excluded, or told you don't belong, Caleb's story is a reminder your worth isn't defined by the voices that try to diminish you. It's defined by the resilience that keeps you standing when those voices fade. If this story moves you, and you want to hear more journeys of resilience, identity, and the unexpected twists that turn pain into triumph, make sure to follow Hard Stories. Because here, every story finds its heartbeat, and every heartbeat deserves to be heard. The grand hall of Rutherford Academy shimmered with polished chandeliers, the kind of light meant to flatter those who had returned hoping to prove themselves. Caleb Frost pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the glow, dressed in a plain white t-shirt, worn jeans, and sneakers whose heels were nearly gone. He carried himself without spectacle, yet the quiet sound of his shoes on the marble floor drew whispers. Conversations thinned, laughter softened, and soon the murmurs began. "Is that really him?" someone asked, just loud enough to echo. Several former classmates rose to greet him, their hands extended in practiced politeness. Brooke leaned in with a shallow smile, her embrace more for show than sincerity. Chase offered a handshake that lingered only a second before his eyes drifted over Caleb's appearance with thinly veiled contempt. Around them, heads bent together, lips curved into smirks. Every gesture of welcome carried a weight of mockery. At the center of the stage stood Tyler, holding the microphone like a prop he had never truly earned, once the self-proclaimed comedian of the class. Tyler had made a career out of small stages and smaller crowds. Yet tonight, this hall was his arena. and Caleb his target. He adjusted his tie, smirked, and began to spin a familiar tale. "Does anyone remember graduation night?" Tyler asked, his voice booming through the speakers. The crowd stirred. "Remember our friend Caleb here clutching that little rainbow pin like it was the crown jewels?" His chuckle broke into exaggerated laughter. "I thought he might marry it right there on stage." The audience burst into laughter, their voices colliding in cruel harmony. The sound filled every corner of the room, drowning out the music, pressing against Caleb, like waves of an old storm. The echo was familiar. This was how it had always been. Humiliation wrapped in jokes, cruelty disguised as entertainment. Caleb did not move. He sat near the back, his eyes steady, hands resting loosely in his lap. He listened without reaction, his silence unsettling those who turned to see if he would flinch. There was no collapse, no visible pain, only a stillness that neither invited pity nor offered vulnerability. As the evening carried on, more jokes laced their way into conversations. Tyler circled the room with a microphone, urging classmates to share memories of Caleb. One recalled the time his sneakers squeaked through the hallway. Another mocked the notebooks he decorated with careful drawings instead of sports scores. Every word was an attempt to resurrect an image of failure, to reduce him again to the loser who had been easy to discard. But this time, the stage no longer belonged to them. Their laughter had grown desperate, their voices sharper, as though they were trying to convince themselves that their own lives had meaning in comparison. Caleb, sitting quietly in his chair, understood something they did not. The more they mocked, the more they revealed their need for someone else to carry their insecurities. The hall that glimmered with chandeliers and pride was only a mirror of the fear inside those who filled it. Caleb's silence became its own kind of defiance. He wasn't there to erase the past. He was there to let the past reveal itself for what it truly was, a theater of fragile egos playing the same tired script. It is often said that cruelty reflects more about the one who delivers it than the one who receives it. That night, every cruel laugh aimed at Caleb told a story not of his weakness, but of their fear. For those listening, it is worth remembering mockery often masks insecurity, and the courage to remain still in the face of it can be more powerful than any defense. The reunion pressed forward under the bright chandeliers, but beneath the polished surfaces and the laughter that rang too loudly, fractures were beginning to show. Caleb Frost remained seated at the edge of the hall, still and deliberate, watching the spectacle unfold. He didn't need to speak. The room was already revealing itself piece by piece. Chase was the first to falter. He strutted toward the bar, boasting about his latest startup venture, his words rich with promises of investment and expansion. Yet when he swiped his card to pay for a round of drinks, the machine beeped sharply, denying the transaction. His face stiffened, his laugh grew forced, and he quickly patted his pockets as though searching for another card that never appeared. The bartender's raised eyebrow cut deeper than any insult, and Caleb saw the faint red crawl across Chase's cheeks. Nearby, Brooke glided through the crowd, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She raised her hand often, letting the light catch the diamond on her finger. People leaned in to admire it, but what they didn't see, what Caleb's watchful eyes did, was the tiny line of metal tarnish near the setting, the telltale shimmer of glass instead of stone. She twisted it nervously whenever anyone leaned too close, her smile never reaching her eyes. And then there was Tyler. The microphone was still in his hand, but the bravado was beginning to crack. Between jokes, his fingers trembled, his laughter too quick, too hollow. He wiped his forehead more than once. Though the hall was cool, his body betraying the nerves he worked so hard to disguise. Caleb sat back in his chair, absorbing it all. These were the people who had once towered over him, their voices loud enough to drown out his own. They had been cruel with certainty, confident in their power to define him. Now, the certainty was gone. What remained were masks patched with lies, slipping the longer the night stretched on. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had once laughed at his rainbow pin, mocking it as if it were proof of weakness. Yet here they stood, hiding behind counterfeit rings, overdrawn cards, and brittle egos. The same classmates who had demanded conformity now lived in fear of exposure themselves. They still saw Caleb as the boy they had dismissed, the boy who would always be a loser in their story. But in their blindness, they had missed the quiet transformation. Caleb didn't rise to correct them. He didn't need to. He understood something more important. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when hidden beneath layers of performance. Their arrogance had aged into desperation. Their laughter had become a shield against their own failures. And while they clung to their illusions, Caleb carried only honesty about who he was, about where he came from, and about the battles he had fought to stand in this very room. Sometimes the greatest power lies not in exposing others, but in recognizing that their cruelty was never about you. It was about their own fear of being seen for who they truly are. In watching Chase stumble, Brooke conceal, and Tyler shake, Caleb felt no triumph. He only felt clarity. The lesson lingered in the air of that hall masks may protect for a time, but they always begin to crack. And when they do, the truth beneath them speaks louder than any laughter ever could. The night had ripened into the moment Tyler had been waiting for. With the microphone clutched like a weapon, his grin spread wide across the stage. He tapped it twice, calling for silence. The echoes bouncing against the polished walls. The crowd hushed, eyes turning toward him, anticipation buzzing like static in the air. Tyler adjusted his blazer, clearing his throat with theatrical flair, and now he announced, drawing out the words with practiced pause, "It's time for a very special honor. Our most unique classmate, the one and only Caleb Frost." A roar of laughter crashed through the hall. Glasses clinked as hands slapped tables. Whistles and mocking applause rose like a wave. The spotlight shifted, catching Caleb seated near the back. Every head turned to watch him, every eye eager to see him stumble forward into ridicule once more. Caleb stood, his steps measured, neither hurried nor hesitant. The sound of his sneakers against the polished floor was a steady drumbeat in the silence between bursts of laughter. He reached the stage, the weight of 1,000 smirks pressing against him. Tyler handed him the microphone with exaggerated reverence, expecting a stammer, a flush, perhaps a retreat. But Caleb didn't take the mic. Instead, he slipped his phone from his pocket, pressed a few buttons, and tilted the screen toward the projector. In an instant, the laughter dimmed. On the towering screen behind him appeared the bold mastheads of Forbes, TechCrunch, Bloomberg. Articles filled the hall with words sharper than any insult: Green Frost Technologies, a rising giant in the industry. Valuation surpasses $100 million. Photographs showed Caleb standing at conferences, shaking hands with investors, presenting innovations that had reshaped the market. The room froze. Whispers broke like cracks in ice. Brooke's lips parted, her ringed hand lowering from her chest. Chase's drink hovered midair, forgotten. Even Tyler faltered, the smirk sliding from his face as the microphone drooped in his hand. Caleb's voice, calm and even, filled the hall. This room, this evening, the very stage you stand on, all of it exists because I chose to fund it. I paid for tonight, not for recognition, but because I believed the past deserved closure. His gaze swept the crowd. The difference between us is simple. I chose to believe in myself when it mattered most. You chose to believe in fear. Silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. The mocking laughter that had filled the hall only minutes earlier was gone. Eyes that once glanced at him with derision now stared downward, unable to meet his. The chandeliers above seemed almost too bright, as though exposing every hidden flaw, every false layer of superiority that had ruled this room for years. Caleb lowered his phone, his expression composed, unshaken. The boy they had tried to reduce to a joke now stood revealed as the one who had rewritten the story entirely. The loser they had named was the benefactor who had quietly bought the roof over their heads. In that silence, a lesson carved itself into the air: arrogance often builds its throne on fragile ground. Those who mock others rarely see how quickly the balance can turn, how laughter can choke into silence when truth is revealed. Caleb had not needed anger or revenge. He had needed only the steady power of his own growth. And as he stepped away from the stage, leaving Tyler frozen in place, the hall learned that the most dangerous thing to underestimate is not weakness, but resilience. The silence after Caleb Frost's words hung heavy, as if the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Former classmates shifted in their seats, some murmuring to each other, others staring at the floor in shame. For a moment, it seemed as though the night had reached its final chapter. The boy once mocked had risen above them all, and the story was complete. But Caleb knew it wasn't. His journey had never been only about wealth or success. It was about reclaiming something deeper, something they had once tried to strip from him. And now, in the very place where the ridicule had first found its voice, he was ready to claim it openly. As he stepped down from the stage, hands reached toward him, chased with forced enthusiasm. Brooke with a trembling smile, Tyler with an empty stare, but Caleb did not pause. He continued forward until he reached the last row of seats. From there, a figure rose: Adrian Monroe. Adrian's presence had been quiet all evening, unnoticed among the crowd. He wore no tuxedo, no polished display of wealth, just a tailored suit that spoke of quiet confidence, a face composed with strength, and eyes fixed only on Caleb. Without hesitation, Caleb reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had always belonged together. Caleb turned, his voice carrying through the hall without the aid of a microphone. "This is Adrian Monroe, the one who stood beside me when the world told me I was not enough. The one who taught me that victory isn't measured only in dollars or headlines, but in living fully, without apology." A ripple of shock coursed through the audience. Gasps broke the air, some stifled, others unrestrained. These were the same classmates who had once laughed at a rainbow pin, who had turned his identity into a weapon of humiliation. And now they were confronted with it not as a weakness, but as a triumph. Caleb wasn't only the founder of a $100 million company. He was a man unafraid to stand in love, to stand in truth, in front of those who had tried to bury him beneath shame. The hall remained suspended in disbelief until, slowly, one pair of hands began to clap, then another. The applause grew, hesitant at first, then stronger, until it filled the room. But it wasn't the laughter of mockery anymore. It was the sound of recognition, the reluctant acknowledgement that strength had been redefined before their very eyes. Caleb squeezed Adrian's hand, his gaze sweeping across the hall one final time. He didn't need their approval. He never had. What he had needed was to prove to himself that his story, his truth, could stand unbroken in the place where it had once been shattered. And in that moment, he had done exactly that. The lesson of that night was clear. The world will try to convince you that your difference is your downfall. But sometimes what they label as weakness becomes the very power that sets you free. Now, let me ask you, if you were Caleb, would you have walked back into that hall to face the voices that once tore you down? Or would you have left the past behind? Tell us what you think. And don't forget to follow Heart Stories, where stories of resilience, truth, and the human spirit find their voice.